Hi everybody, I'm Michael Human. I'm going to set this off to the side in case I step back and I want to crash into it. And I'm from Havara Shalom. And what I want to do for the next 20 minutes or so is ask you to take out this 4-page handout that is on your desk. I want you to follow along with it. Feel free to write and scribble on it as you need to, either further notes or things that you have questions about or you're agitated about, whatever it is. I also invite you to hold on to it. We're not going to cover all of the drawings that are on or all the graphs that are on here tonight, and we're going to refer back to these again in the future. We're going to ask you to refer back to them again. So with that, let's get started. So this is going to be an example, another example of the yes, no, yes. So hopefully it'll be clear to you as we move along. Those of you who did the reading will know that what we're talking about is the polis. The polis is also described from the Greek as the word for city-state. In essence, it's the public arena where decision-making happens, where engagement happens in civilized society. We call that the polis. And if you think on the drawings that you have here, the graphs, the rectangle is the polis. That's the arena, if you will. And inside that arena, on that first drawing, there are 3 circles that are equal in size that represent the 3 sectors back in the 1830s that Alex de Tocqueville wrote about and was so astounded by because of their newness. Notwithstanding the fact that even that back then all of these folks were left out of what was happening in the United States in its infancy, this was nonetheless a dramatic change. There had never been in the world that was known at that time, and the civilizations at that time, a structure of government called a democracy that worked like this, where there were 3 sectors that were sort of in balance. In Europe, they were for the most part monarchies. Elsewhere, they were other dictatorships where you basically had a ruler, a smaller elite ruling class, and then you had large minions of people who were ruled, who had no voice, who had no say. And they were done to. Well, in the United States, in those days, this country was founded on something different. And so de Tocqueville came over in the 1830s, and we've been around by then for about 50 years to take a look. What is this thing like? And was astounded and wrote the book that he wrote. And the 3 sectors that he talks about are the government sector, the market sector, and the civil sector of society. And these, at that time, the thing that was so astounding was that there was a free civil sector of society that not only was allowed to gather and to have a voice, but did gather, did have a voice, and actually acted as a brake or an impetus on the other 2 sectors in ways that hadn't been seen before. Again, remembering it didn't include everybody, but this was new. This was something that was very, very different from what had been done before. So the market sector you can think of as anything around in the way of business and industry, and government, of course, can be local government or regional government or national government. And the civil sector is made up of the rest of us, not made up of us as individuals, but rather as we gather, or as people gathered back then, as free associations, craft guilds, churches, and other organizations like that. Those organizations had an active function, and they mediated for the people that they represented. That is to say, if you had a gripe and you had a problem and your needs weren't being met, oftentimes back then you would take it to the guild, you would take it to the Grange, or you would take it to the church, and they would help decipher what it is, and they would help you get what you needed. It kind of served as a way for us to come together and make things happen, right? So that was pretty unusual. So now, following along in time a little bit, let's move on to the late 1800s up until about 1930 or so, and things started changing a little bit. On the drawing that you see here, you can see that the government sector and the civil sector of society are roughly the same size as they were in the 1830s, and what's changed is the market sector is getting a little bit larger. It's growing a little bit, and people in the 1890s, excuse me, were feeling pressures. They were feeling pressures because large, growing industrial sectors, including the railroads, the robber barons, as they were called, the brand new telephone companies, the Wall Street firms, already back then, the Wall Street firms, and other large business entities were exercising power over certain segments of society. And so people started in their organizations rebelling against that, chafing at that, and giving pushback. People were dissatisfied because they didn't feel that the government was doing a good job of controlling these special interests in the market sector. And so they put on efforts to make change. One of the efforts that was going on at that time was called the Gilded Age, where people came together and particularly farmers formed alliances, and they developed what became called the Populist Party. And there was also another one that was called the Civil Rights Coalition, and they were arguing for and lobbying for things to change so that the market wouldn't impact on them so much, because goods were costing lots of money all of a sudden, and that money was being concentrated. There was also a struggle at that time between the urban northeast part of the country versus the agricultural southeastern part of the country and the newly forming western parts of the country. So there was kind of a great divide and a tension there. Also around this time, because this goes up into the 30s, was the suffragette movement. The suffrage movement, where women finally were getting a voice and were pushing for their own rights. And so they were holding their own, and they were giving pushback to the market sector, if you will. Now, if you turn the page, the date on the top of this graph says 1941. It really should say 1933 to 1978. And there were a series of characterizations: the New Deal, the World War II, changes in the labor movement, and in 1950, the Treaty of Detroit. And what you can see in this drawing here is both the market sector has grown yet again, it is bigger, and now the government sector has also grown. The civil sector has gotten a little bit smaller. Part of what is characterizing this, of course, was the great downturn in the economy due to the Depression, which was rigged a little bit, if you will, or influenced to no small extent by Wall Street and the investors. And that is kind of exemplified by that growing market sector. And so the government stepped up, became a little bit bigger, because they created what were called the 3 R's, the efforts for relief, recovery, and reform. Relief was for the unemployed and for the poor, because the Great Depression was raging and people were suffering greatly. And then the recovery of the economy. And through the recovery of the economy, the government took a bigger role, not only putting people to work, but also building infrastructure. That was a time that dams were built, that roads were built, electrical infrastructure was built that hasn't been improved upon much since. And the 3rd R was reform, and that was trying to reform the financial system. And as you can imagine, that larger market sector didn't acquiesce easily, but they were giving some pushback. In terms of the war, of course, is a huge issue, right? And government needed to get a little bit bigger to respond to this international war that was being fought in Europe when we finally did join it. And what will probably be no surprise to you, the business sector, the market sector, grew tremendously as a result of the war. It was, after all, the industrial sector that developed all of the armaments and all of the materiel that was sent over to support the war effort, and they profited mightily, and they got bigger. Then after the war, labor started gaining a little bit of strength. That's in the civil sector of society, of course. And there was this thing called the Treaty of Detroit. And the Treaty of Detroit is unusual because it made a great big difference all of a sudden. The UAW, the United Automobile Workers, had a tradition. They were an established union by then, and after the war, the men came back and wanted their jobs. But the employers weren't wanting to give them much in the way of jobs or monetary increases, and so there'd be labor and management struggles, and there'd be strikes every year. Well, management didn't like to have strikes every year. They wanted a contract that would last for more than a year. And what the UAW was able to negotiate with GM was an agreement for a 5-year contract where the contract would have a life of 5 years. What they got in return for that is something that was relatively remarkable, and it has influenced the rest of this country. What they got was a pension that was 100% funded by the employers, by the corporation. They also got health benefits. First time that in a union contract, medical benefits for their workers and their family was covered. They also codified some vacation leave that was in writing. And it also, because they were going to get a 5-year labor contract, built in writing, annual cost of living increases as needed by inflation. Dramatic. This had never happened before. And once it started with GM's contract, the next year it was adopted by Chrysler and by Ford, the big three. And after that, it started getting adopted very quickly by other labor movements and unions in their negotiations. And what that did is, in a very short amount of time, that doubled the amount of people who were able to buy houses in the United States. All of a sudden, it established blue-collar workers into the middle class. They had an income that they could live on, they could have savings, they had the promise of retirement, they had health care benefits, they had cost of living increases. That was tremendous. That was an example of the civil sector society coming together and lobbying for their own self-interest and making change happen. So a real positive thing.
In the 50s, when was this?
That was in 1950 was when the Treaty of Detroit happened. So it was in the 50s when it started spreading. So I want to move us on to the fourth diagram here, which is the polis kind of as it is today. You notice anything different there?
Oh, yeah.
So things have changed a little bit, and in a sense, the market sector has really dominated the polis. It has permeated virtually every aspect of our society. When I'm talking about the market sector, hope I still have time here, I want to talk about this a little bit, unpack it a little bit. The market sector includes the extractive industries of petroleum, natural gas, and coal, right? Those industries are part of that. Certainly the financial industries and financial businesses of Wall Street and banking in general, even the banks that came to small towns, as well as retail and manufacturing, right? Those are all part of that market sector. Now, it of course includes small mom and pop businesses as well, but they probably didn't have quite as much influence as the larger, bigger businesses had on all of us. And it started permeating with Wall Street and communications and media, because media started growing as an empire, if you will, from radio to television, and billboards and all the other forms of communication that we have that allowed the market sector to become ever present in our lives. So that's part of the way that it has grown. As a result of that, some say that the market owns government, that they influence, and certainly with the passage, but the ruling from the Supreme Court about Citizens United, all of a sudden, how much money you have makes a difference in terms of how much free speech you have. And organized money has a larger voice than unorganized money, it would appear. And as a result of that, the relationship around regulations from government back to the industrial or market sector has changed quite a bit. And in addition to that, as it's reflected in this drawing, that little teeny dot, that little black dot, that's barely a speck, is the civil sector of society. that we have a much smaller role to play now. It's not because we're fewer in number. We're bigger now than we've ever been, but we have less organization, less voice. And the little dotted line around that would be the Biocommons community, right? So part of this has been that there's been a mantra that what we need to keep society viable is unfettered growth. The gross domestic product has to keep growing, and if it doesn't keep growing, then society will collapse. But as a result of that, we use more and more of the scarce resources that this earth has to offer. That's going into making the petroleum products we rely on, the manufactured goods that we rely on, for transport of materials or for anything else. And at the same time, there's all those byproducts, the toxic materials, the waste of the short-term products that are filling up the holes in the ground that have been dug to extract those goodies to make things happen. Some people are saying that that the market now threatens the collapse of the environment because they're over-extracting from what the earth can give. And that if the rest of the world lived the way that we in the United States lived, we would need 6 planets to support it. And so there's also a difference, a dichotomy now. So what I'm talking about here is the Polis in the United States, but taking just a brief minute and talking about it globally, there's also been a move to slow down the growth in developing countries because there's a recognition that not all of them can afford what it is we're trying to sell and market, and nor could the earth support all of that. Yeah.
Sorry, where did that slowing come from, or who started it?
Because not all the markets are going to make lots of money by pushing their products into all of the countries or all corners of third world countries. So they're marketing to whom? They're marketing to the ruling class, the folks who are more likely to be able to afford it. Right? So they're marketing to them, but they're not marketing to the folks who can't afford it. That might create even more unrest globally if you think about that.
Can I say something on
Yes,
that?
please.
And the whole loan thing as well, creating debt
That's the other part of
to
it.
developing countries, offering money, but they have to repay it, so they're constantly in debt, and that's obviously something that strangles the development.
Well, and debt is a big part of our society as well, right? We rely on the banking system. We feel, because we're the recipients of messages from the corporations, that we're not happy unless we have more, unless we have new, unless we have the latest. And so to do that, oftentimes we need to borrow. Yeah.
Is it true, Millennium Development Goals, are those based on a capitalist model? Does anybody know this? Okay.
So I'm not exactly sure about the millennial goals, but I'm not aware of very many goals, economic goals from the United States, certainly not dominant economic goals that are based on anything other than market sector interests. Right, it's not based on sustainability.
Yeah.
We're not there yet. So,
I have a question.
yes,
Are we allowed to question this model yet?
go right ahead.
I'm feeling a little bit disempowered by this model as a human being and as a person who feels some family with the people and
And the
creatures
life
we've
forms,
invited
sure,
in,
yeah.
that we would be somehow following the allure of someone who is victimizing us by telling us that we have to be afraid or think that there's scarcity, and that we would just run out and buy the next thing. And I mean, though I do agree that that's occurring, I'm
You're
shocked
troubled by-
by
you're
my
troubled by
feelings
that.
about that. Yeah.
Sit with that for a while. But thank you for sharing that. I'm not going to take that away from you. I'm not defending this, I'm more explaining it. So if you will, the original model from that first graph would have been the first yes, this very new positive thing, this relationship among the 3 sectors of society that hadn't existed before in modern times up to then, at least not that we know of anywhere else, was the yes. And the no was this gradual shift over time to making it out of balance as opposed to what was in balance. And so that we're now living, if you will, in the great no. in a certain sense. And that great no, whether you think of it in ecological or environmental terms, whether you think of it about the species or even about the human beings that are left out of the decision making, including us, that's part of that imbalance. The second yes is not that we want to go back to the 1830s. That's not realistic, that's not going to happen. But what we do want to do is we do want to restore balance. We think that there is an interest for all of us, a value for all of us to try to develop a little bit more balance to what we have. So if you will, bear with me for just a couple more minutes and go to the third page. I want to break down or unpack a little bit what the civil sector of society is. So when you think of, and that's the top graph there, the traditional civil sector of society. And we want to start giving you the term to think about and chew on, organized mediating communities. Mediating because they stand to help us get our needs met. They stand to shelter us or deflect a little bit of the negative things that are coming that perhaps support us in times of need. But that's an aspirational goal. That's not a given of our organizations today. All of you are here from faith-based institutions, and I don't imagine that many of you would say that your institution is a thriving, mediating institution. In fact, that may be a new word for you, but there may be some mediating that goes on, but I don't know if you would all say that, yeah, my institution absolutely mediates for me, but that is an aspirational goal where we think we could attain that or do a better job of it than we're doing now. But what is then the organized mediating communities of the civil sector? Well, we think that it's made up of at least 4 parts. One of them would be the congregations that we're all a part of. Another one would be organized labor, whether they're local unions or they're international unions. But those are voluntary associations that help people get what they need. The third one would be education, or the educational sector, even though some of that is paid for by government. There's also private schools, but schools traditionally over time would help families who were immigrating to this country do a really better job of understanding either a language or how to go and function in society, how to get a library card, right? Schools mediate for kids, and they teach us how to be citizens and how to function in society. But it used to play a role for that with adults as well. And I would actually say some of the Portland public schools is doing that with the Latino community. There's a school not far from here called Rigler School, which holds English language classes for the parents of the monolingual Spanish-speaking kids. So evenings and weekends they hold classes where they teach them English, and they also teach them how to function, how things work. How do you go and interact with the bank and set up a bank account, things like that. That's an example of a mediating institution. That's helping people function and get by in society and get their needs met, right? Does that make sense? So then the last group would be nonprofit voluntary organizations. And here you can think of starting to have some of these groups that weren't met before, that didn't have their interests met, now are being met. We have the Urban League, we have the NAACP, we have women's organizations, the League of Women Voters, although that's not just about women and for women, but that's how it began. We also have organizations, voluntary organizations, that may be the voice of some of these other species, like the Sierra Club, Thousand Friends of Oregon, groups like that. So they're there. But if you now move to the last, the fourth and last chart, the second one on this page, there's a problem right now currently with our organizations, our organized mediating communities, and that is if this circle down below with dots and clouds on it represents your church or some other organization that you know about, what we see here is that we're fragmented, largely disengaged from the public sector or public arena. Some of our institutions, I dare say many of our institutions, are in survival mode. Our numbers are dwindling, and we're trying to just keep our heads above water, keep our doors open. Numerous churches that have been part of the Metropolitan Alliance for Common Good, or MACG, which I'm also part of, several others in here are part of, have had to consolidate and join together with other churches because their membership was dwindling so much. Some have even closed their doors. And those who are engaged in the public sector oftentimes are engaged more in doing charity or service work for those in dramatic need. That's important work. That needs to be done, absolutely, but if that's all we're doing and we're not meeting upstream needs, then we got a bit of a problem there too. And they're not necessarily engaged in larger citizenship, taking action for the common good rather than trying to meet the needs of those needed. Some of us feel that even within our organizations, again, if you look at that bottom circle, that the dots are their congregational members and the clouds might be the steering committee, or it could be the social action committee, or the religious school for children. There are some groupings that get together, but oftentimes they're separated from each other. They're isolated in separate silos. And I would also suggest that this circle, this diagram, could even be a characterization of the relationship of organizations amongst each other. That churches oftentimes don't function well together with other institutions and join their voices together to have a larger impact. And I will say that my own institution, Havra Shalom, is represented in this circle here, where the parishioners are, or the congregation members are the individual dots. They come together for worship. They say, hi, how you doing? And then they go back home again. You've got a group that is in one committee or another committee, but they don't necessarily come together as a cohesive whole. So, does this make sense to you as an analysis? Can you see that perhaps that we may need to work together to make a difference, to make real change happen? We don't have the answers to how we're going to do that, but right now we're saying we think there's a need there, and we think it might be in our self-interest to come together and to strengthen our relationships. And if you are in a mediating community that is more successful than others, congratulations, that's wonderful. And don't you want to keep that strengthened and vibrant and growing? Cecil, I think I'm about out of time. I'm two over, oh my goodness. Okay, so ideally this is meant to be a little alarming, meant to be a little saddening, and it's meant to say that we have an opportunity to come together in action, and this is what we're recommending. So now I'm 3 minutes over, but what I'd like to do is ask you to pair off with another individual for a one-to-one meeting. And what I'd like you to consider in your dialogue with the person, and this time pick somebody, again, who you hopefully don't know yet, and I want you to do two things. One is, how do you respond to this? And, oh, I didn't even, hold on, I'm going to be 5 minutes over. I didn't even mention that last one, the title was called a kleptocracy. I don't know how many know the definition of a kleptocracy, but it is a situation where a government serves the interests of businesses or some other elite sectors, where government acts to increase the personal power of those businesses, the business class or the ruling class, at the expense of everybody else. Does that sound a little bit like where we're at today, maybe? A little bit? We're not a true kleptocracy. A true kleptocracy, try to say that fast, is where you actually have government leaders that are skimming off and lining their own pockets directly. Here it's indirect.
Wait, we don't
Sometimes.
No, it's indirect. It's indirect. They're not lining their own. They're getting them lined by the PACs and other things like that. But so that's what that is. So the two questions I want you to think about is, how do you respond to this in general? And what is your experience with the ramifications of the scenario, of this kleptocracy, of what we're living under today, of this experience with this out of balance market sector, government sector, and civil sector? So with that, find somebody and